So good afternoon, and welcome to the second part of today's program. Sorry for the delay. It's just 17 minutes after 3, so we're still very much on time, I would say. We've got a very long program ahead of us today. I'll start with the end. So at about At about 10 p.m., we will have the fucking boys, and that will be in Kula. So they will present a film called Cost of Money, and after that, they'll do kind of a talk, an intervention, and then there will be a party afterwards. Before that, at the ICI, at 7:30, we will have a performance by the guys you just saw. They're called Beaters. The performance will be called Media Minerals, which will be a spoken word and sound lecture. And we will have, Beaters is a bit of a Larry Achampong and David Blandy. Biters. Oh, thank you. I missed, I saw a T. But it works also. There's something bitter about the whole thing. So the biters, thank you for the correction. And Sasha Kola will give some notes on that. At 6 p.m., we will have a keynote lecture by Mantia Diawara, who's not yet around. He's in Berlin, but he will come, for which we're very happy. And now, the second panel for today. With it. No, the third one is tomorrow. The second one, contested geopolitics before and after the scramble, which will be moderated by Saskia Köpschel, who's a manager at Savvy Contemporary and a part of the curatorial team called To Whom It May Concern. So, thank you all for coming.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Bonaventure, for the introduction. And thank you especially to our 3 panelists who joined us this afternoon. Some of them all the way from New York this morning. So welcome to Vanessa Egar-Jones, to Yen Kinyiha, and Dirk Schmidt. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this discussion this afternoon. And I would like to start off actually by picking up on a remark that Bilgin Ayata made this morning, when she was kind of criticizing, scolding Bonaventure for making a separation between theorists and practitioners, with which I think she misunderstood him a little bit. But she was making an important point that she said it's important that we bring those two things together, right? And especially when we talk about the legacy of colonial histories in our present. So it made me think of a song by Mutabaruka, which we played in the break. I don't know if some of you heard it, which is called Revolutionary Words Have Become Entertainment, which I often think about when I sit in discussion rounds, which was, of course, dedicated to his fellow dub poets, criticizing them for not really living what they say, or for their words being separate from how they act in the world. And I think we're all trying to keep this gap very narrow, between what we, between our rhetorics and what we do. And I think that actually the people who we got to have on our panels, all of them, are very much at the intersection of that, of thinking about history and theory very much in relation to what it can do in the world. So, and that is very true, especially for our 3 panelists who we have here today. So I'm very happy to welcome them. And it has been said a few times before today, but I think it's important to repeat it, that we're not trying to be pedantic about history with, always talking about bringing up this issue of colonialism again. No, we're not trying to just be good academics or something, although some of us also try to be that. Um, and we don't, we spend our sleepless nights, we invite people to come from New York to talk about this, because we actually feel it's something is a very urgent, very acute thing to do. Something very necessary to do, right now. So our program is, our humble attempt to grasp with the past and understand how it influences our here, our today, and in order to know where we can go from here in the future. To make this past relevant for a critical engagement with the present. So we took the Berlin Congo Conference and the 130 years, how do you say that? Anniversary. Anniversary is kind of a strange word for it because it sounds a little bit too festive. But we took that as a starting point to reflect on the repercussions of colonialism today. And especially always emphasizing the point that we all live in the aftermath of colonialism, which is also why Njami, who will join us later today, I hope, or tomorrow, picked the title Wir sind alle Berliner, We Are All Berliners, 1884 to 2014. So the title of this panel is Contested Geopolitics, Before and After the Scramble. And while in all the, in our panels we try to really touch upon all aspects of, repercussions of colonialism, in this particular one we want to zoom in and concentrate on a particular aspect of empire, namely the division of geographic space, the arbitrary partition of the African continent, the creation of borders that were drawn in order to negotiate and redistribute economic resources and human resources, human workforce as well, and were, as we all know, completely unrelated to geographical and, more importantly, to existing political and linguistic entities. And the Congo Conference is maybe a good starting point to think about this issue, because it's probably one of the most cruel, brutal, and vast examples of colonial division of space and the creation of colonial geographies, where within 3 months, from November to exactly yesterday was the end of the conference 130 years ago, a whole continent, almost an entire continent, was carved up between the colonial powers. So we would like to take that as a starting point to think about the repercussions of this. And while I think we all understand the repercussions on some level in terms of, nation states, in the West we like to talk about, how failed states, so-called failed states, relate to those arbitrary boundaries, borders. I think there's a lot of layers of that that we haven't really understood. So the panelists that we have here today, their work relates very much to this question, and thinking about how colonial geographies also relate to politics of the body, to environmental politics, to racism, and so forth. And one last word, I think it's also not just important to understand the repercussions of this division of space, of colonial geographies, but also how rethinking them can help us to move beyond that. So I think a lot of revolutionary endeavors against colonial repercussions have actually attempted to remap and to reimagine colonial geographies. So I hope we also have a chance to talk about that. I would like to ask Vanessa to start, and I want to give her a proper introduction. Vanessa Eggert-Jones is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the Yale University, where she holds a secondary appointment in the departments of anthropology and African American studies. In 2013 and 14, she held a postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University Society of Fellows in the Humanities, and she earned her PhD from the joint program in anthropology and French studies at New York University. As a political anthropologist, Eggert-Jones specializes in the study of gender and sexuality in the African diaspora. Her ethnographic research focuses on the intersections of sexual and environmental politics and their relationship to debates about sovereignty in the French Caribbean. Her work has been published in Small X, GLQ, and on the medical anthropology platform Somatosphere. Along with historian Manning Marable, she is the editor of Transnational Blackness, Navigating the Global Color Line. And outside of academia, she is the former coordinator of Oakland's Prison Activist Research Center and the former board chair of New York City's Audre Lorde project. She's currently writing a book about pesticides, sexual politics, and post-coloniality in Martinique, which I hope we will hear also. But thank you. Welcome for coming.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello, thank you. You're too kind. Thank you, Saskia. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? Post-lunch, you awake? Yeah. All right, I'll try to keep you lively. It really is a genuine honor and a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I want to thank Saskia and Bonaventure and Awefa and Lynn and Anna and all these wonderful people from Savvy for making it possible for me to join this incredibly important and deeply enlivening set of conversations. Further, I am thrilled that all of you made it here this afternoon for this panel, and I'm really looking forward to our exchange, both about the work that I want to present to you today and also about the broader concerns that we have at hand this weekend. So in the short time that I have with you, I'm trying to keep this in 15 minutes, so bear with the pace. I'd like to first offer a reflection on a particular temporal and spatial coordinate through which we might further apprehend colonial geographies, following those reflections with an example from my own research. And so I work in the Caribbean, so we might be moving to a slightly different geographic and temporal coordinate over the course of this talk. So in the first instance, I'm inspired by thinkers like Achille Mbembe and Anne Stoller, others too, but there's no time to brook their contributions here. I'm inspired by these folks to keep our optics wide enough to include the plantation form and its afterlives as we discuss the epoch ushered in by the Berlin Conference. And in the second instance of what I hope to do today, I plumb the possibilities of continuing to think with the plantation by sharing a bit about the two projects that I have afoot. In one, as Saskia just mentioned, I write about a pesticide and its relationship to sexual politics and post-coloniality on an island in the French Caribbean. And in the other, I use both digital and traditional narrative techniques to trace the commodity chain of that pesticide from Hopewell, Virginia in the United States to various sites in the Atlantic world. So by turning to this work, I want to invite you to consider what thinking through the rubric of body burden, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, what body burden might afford us as we link colonial and capitalist projects, as well as their relationship to Black life across time and space. So the Berlin Conference is said to have ushered in the new imperialism, and because I have reservations about any and every claim to the new, and also about turning our attentions to shift rather than investing and grappling with continuity, I'd like to bring part of our conversation today to what is sometimes called the old imperialism, to the commodity circuits from the centuries that preceded the Berlin Conference, and in particular, those that link the African continent to Europe and to the Americas. And in this old imperialism, we find commodity circuits with which many of you will already be very familiar, right? We have sugar, we have rum, we have cod, we have cotton. And of course, we have enslaved people. And so over the map of these older forms of commodity circulation, we might draw a more recent, though similar cartography, one in which those same circuits are traversed by chemicals. This is what I'm interested in. Regulated and unregulated pharmaceuticals, illicit drugs, fertilizers, pesticides. In a forthcoming book called Duress, Concept Work for Our Times, Anne Stoller argues that we must see the colony and the camp as linked conceptual sites, as a political matrix, part of a constellation elaborating European techniques of power. I think you might have heard a little bit about this during her recent keynote here, if you were in the room. So rather than an orientation that allows for an easy collapse into difference and incommensurability, Stoller instead orients us towards the ways that political rationalities and their irrational applications point at and toward each other, making their references, even in the face of repeated refusals of their commonality. She insists that the colony is not so easily bracketed from the camp. I'm gonna try to do PowerPoint and mic and paper at the same time. In a different elaboration of this critique, in his landmark essay on necropolitics, Achille Mbembe contests the privileging of the camp in European analyses of geographies of domination. And he insists that we also recognize the plantation as a node in this conceptual and political formation of power. He argues in a corrective to Giorgio Agamben that, quote, the very structure of the plantation system and its aftermath manifests the emblematic and paradoxical figure of the state of exception. And so I think Peggy's question earlier about sovereignty is kind of all through this talk too. So following Mbembe, we might refuse to bracket the New World plantation and the colonies of which they were and continue to be a part from other formations of colony, particularly those instantiated by this new imperialism, by this Berlin conference. And as we think about geopolitics before and after the so-called scramble, I always hated that phrase, what would happen if we kept the New World plantation, both as an historical and a contemporary instantiation of colonial geography in view? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story that helps me keep that plantation in view. This is Habitation Belfort, a New World plantation in northern Martinique where I work. But we're going to turn to October 2012. So this was on the cover of France Antilles, the local newspaper in Martinique, in October a couple of years back. On that day, a spokesperson from France's Ministry for the Environment announced the prohibition of lobster fishing off of the shores of Martinique, a French territory in the Caribbean. This was due to high levels of contamination by a pesticide called chlordécone, an organochlorine compound originally produced in the United States that was used for years on Martinique's northern banana plantations, much like the one you saw on the previous slide. On that day, the ministry shut down fishing operations, fearing that consumption of crustaceans would lead to grave health consequences for local eaters, citizen and tourist alike. Local fishermen were devastated, local eaters were too. The chemical runoff from the island's fertile northern triangle had reached the sea, and as a consequence, Martinique's fish are increasingly being diagnosed as toxic. So chlordécone contamination has emerged as a problem for Martinican visions of a healthy environment, as well as for ideas about what foods might make for a healthy body, in addition to becoming important in local debates about gender and sexuality. I'm going to tell you more about that in a moment. But chlordécone is not just a problem for Martinique or for the Caribbean writ large. The chemical is part of an Atlantic world commodity chain that retraces the routes that once were traversed by other toxic materials, themselves linked to violent colonial projects. As a compound that has the power to disrupt endocrine systems, alter hormone loads, and damage reproductive capacities, this environmental toxin might have something to tell us about the relationship between bodies and their environments, bodies and territories, bodies and land, about colonial geographies in the Atlantic world. So foregrounding relations of what I call chemical entanglement, I've been thinking and writing over these last years about the material and metaphorical burdens that human, animal, aquatic, and terrestrial bodies might bear. So body burden is a term used for the past half century by mostly Anglophone toxicologists to describe the accumulated amount of a harmful substance present in a human or an animal body. And so this is a kind of example of how people visualize body burden, right? There are all these different substances kind of piling up, accreting within our bodies, right? Lead, arsenic, mercury, selenium. While body burden's original meaning draws from a scientific definition of contamination, in my work I argue that body burdens are at once metaphorical and material, that they encompass the imagined and the embodied. I'm concerned in this work with the ways that violence is made material both in human bodies and in the geological record. And I chart the accretion and endurance of toxicities both in Martinique's landscape and in its residents' bodies. Mine is a tale of toxic terroir, of malignant geographies, of wondering about the effects of the things that accumulate or accrete in the spaces through which we move and in the spaces beneath our skin. Taking Martinique's chlordécone contamination as a point of departure, but thinking outward from the chemical to other forms of material and immaterial toxicity, and also outward from the island to other nodes on the chemicals commodity circuit. In my research, I've been reworking the idea of body burden to account for the ways that New World bodies, post-slavery bodies, black bodies in the West remain inextricably entangled with the forces of capital, disproportionately porous in the face of exposure to and penetration by both toxic materials and toxic discourses. I wonder how we might use chlordecone as a tracing device for the elaboration of a corporeal as well as a territorial record of colonial and post-colonial violence, thinking human bodies in critical relationship to bodies of land and bodies of water. So this problem returns the plantation as both an historical and a contemporary form to our intellectual and political purview. Just a little bit more about how this problem, yes? Oh yes, I'm sorry, I apologize. I absolutely will. I was very bad. I was told I had a time limit and my paper's too long, so I think I was trying to rush. So I am going to take a moment. I apologize, and I'm happy to go back, okay? So a little bit about how this problem looks on the ground in Martinique. So according to the World Cancer Research Institute, and you have a chart from this institute here, Martinique has the highest rate of prostate cancer in the world. Kind of a strange statistic for this little place in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. Martinican intellectuals Raphaël Confiant and Louis Boutrin have argued that chlordecone exposure can account for these statistics. And in their 2007 exposé, Chronique d'un empoisonnement annoncé, or Chronicle of a Poisoning Foretold, they contend that the island's residents are now facing what they call a genocide by sterilization. Further, they and others worry about what the chemical's byproducts, substances often called environmental estrogens, are doing to people's bodies. Recent popular responses have included panic about male effeminacy and intersex births. Based upon suppositions that heightened estrogen loads have the potential to fundamentally change the workings of our neurological and endocrine systems, ideas about chlordecone exposure have been reconfiguring narratives about the biological basis for same-sex desire and gender transgression. These ideas are also reactivating fears about the salience of post-slavery plantation politics in the elaboration of people's gendered and sexual lives. So for example, this is how this comes up in the course of my time on the island. One of the narratives that I heard during my fieldwork about the origins of same-sex desire, so when I posed the question, okay, so where do same-sex desiring people come from? How do we get kind of these queer lives? I don't use the word queer, but sure. How do we get queer lives? For men in particular, I heard that this was about the ingestion of chlordecone. The idea that their bodies were becoming more estrogenic, and so their desires more womanly. So I'm particularly concerned in this work that we remain mindful while taking anxieties about environmental estrogens and the dangers of chemical entanglement very seriously, and the kinds of environmental racism that gives rise to this problem very seriously, that we don't also fall prey to heteronormative fantasies about so-called normal bodies. So there's a really long and twisted story that I won't have time to tell here about exactly how the chemical made its way to markets in and around the Atlantic world, but here it is in brief. Chlordecone was first synthesized in 1951 in the United States, right here at the Hopewell, Virginia Allied Chemical and Dye Company factory. It was patented for the commercial market the very next year, and widespread production of the compound began in 1958 under the names Kepone and GC1189. From 1958 to 1975, Allied's factories pumped out 3.6 million pounds, I'm sorry, I don't have kilograms, 3.6 million pounds, it's a lot, of the active material. They made 55 different commercial formulations of the chemical for the market. Of these formulations, the most popular were pesticides, created to combat roaches, leaf-eating insects, and the larvae of a variety of root-boring pests. According to the US National Research Council, between 90 and 99.2% of the chlordecone produced from 58 to 75 was exported. This was not for use in the US. 90 to 99.2% of it was exported to Latin America, to Africa, and to the Caribbean. In the continental United States, the compound was only registered for use in very low doses in ant and cockroach traps, thus market saturation came quickly. But its recombinations elsewhere were of a much stronger concentration and were intended for widespread application in agriculture industries. Chlordecone proved to be really effective in tropical agriculture. It killed organisms that had developed resistances to less potent compounds. But the problem with chlordecone was its persistence. Various studies have posited that it would take between 350 and 600 years for the compound to break down naturally in the environment. So the chemical is in the land and in people's bodies, in most of our bodies, to stay. So Allied did a really brisk business marketing chlordecone until 1975, when there was an accident at their Hopewell factory, this very factory in Virginia. 150 workers were exposed to the chemical at very high doses, and as much as 45,000 kilograms of the compound was spilled into the James River. While early scientific studies focused on the acute effects of direct exposure for the workers, the deep contamination of the river, of the James, prompted further attention to chlordecone's chronic impacts. The year after the spill, the United States' Food and Drug Administration halted all chlordecone production in the US. And by 1979, an International Agency for Cancer Research had declared chlordecone to be a possible carcinogen and a certain endocrine disruptor. But the planters in Martinique refused this removal of chlordecone from the island. So white planters in Martinique are descendants of the island's first slaveholding families. They're called the Béquets. And there's a particular company, the Société de la Garrigue, that came up with a plan. Representatives from that company flew to the United States. They bought the patent for chlordecone from Allied, even though Allied was no longer able to use or produce this compound. They contracted with a factory in Brazil to produce more chlordecone under a new name. And through a combination of economic and political pressure, they received authorization from Parisian officials to bring what they now called Curlone to the market. And so from 1972 to 1993, this planter society created a new southern circuit, a new southern geography for the distribution of this pesticide, even after its formal interdiction by international regulatory bodies in the global north. And so these particular politics offer people a new vector for critique in Martinique, right? Because it's a part of France. People on the island understood themselves to be under the protection of French law, yet they were not, right? Which they often are not. So I'm finding that this compound, this molecule that you see here, is a unit that helps me rethink the coordinates of colonial geographies, bringing me not only to individual bodies, but also to the chemicals circulating within and beyond them. Chlordecone has and continues to call attention to the intimate ways in which Martinican bodies are connected to commodity chains, to uneven relations of post-colonial power, and thus to world systems. Its accumulation in the land and in people's bodies offers us a trace of transnational capital, a corporeal archive of the power to let live or make die, of techniques of bio and necro power. For me, someone trained as an anthropologist in that preeminently colonial enterprise. Ethnographically, taking a chlordecone molecule as a unit of analysis recalibrates the scale of ethnographic practice, bringing me not only to the body, but also to the land and to the chemicals circulating within and beyond it. So in this way, our bodies emerge as important sites of and I'm making a nod here to Karen Barad, a feminist science studies scholar, intra-action, sites on the ground that encourage us to look in the ground, a position from which we might ask new and more finely calibrated questions about how individual bodies and individual people come to be in dynamic relationship to the soils and to the worlds around them. So in Martinique right now, the paradigmatic narrative about the origins of gendered forms of sociality, violent relations on the plantation, that is the story we tell in the Caribbean, not just in Martinique, about our relationships to each other. This story is being reformulated by our emergent anxieties about gender variation's relationship to chlordecone's more subtle form of plantation violence. It is a violence of accretion, one that reminds Martinican residents that the plantation past is not just past, rather that it lives on in the economic systems that continue to rely upon this mode of production, that it leaves its traces in the soils, and that it remains in the pesticides that agricultural industries employ, chemicals that are changing our bodies, as well as our ideas about what our bodies are made of. The contamination is a very real reminder of the burdens that our bodies do carry, a reminder that it urges us to question what it might mean to be truly decolonized. What does sovereignty mean in this context? What does it mean to be decolonized, not just in our minds or in our soils, but also in our bodies? Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for this brilliant presentation. And I'm sure there's many questions for your talk. I'm going to open up the floor for questions in a bit, and I'm using the privilege of being the moderator of asking the first, one, where I would like to come back to your point about scale, because I think it's a very powerful idea to take something as small as a molecule or a body or even the plantation, but as a point of departure to think about, topics as big as colonial geographies, the violence of colonialism and the repercussions of it on our bodies. So I would like you to say one or two more words about that, about taking the molecule, as kind of a window to look at all of that.
Thank you very much for the question and for the engagement. So one of the things that I am often trying to grapple with is precisely this question of scale, and also the question of how we might imagine different futures. And I think you alluded to this in your opening to our panel about kind of what kinds of new maps might we draw, what kinds of new connections might we imagine. And part of what I'm working on in the project of tracing this molecule in the Atlantic is a mapping project where I really think there's something to be said for. I was just in Hopewell, Virginia a couple of months ago and talking with people who live in the shadow of this factory, kind of a Black community, marginalized community of people who are suffering from all kinds of chronic illness that may or may not be related to the contamination of the James, to this chlordacone, about the ways that chlordacone links them materially to people in a place called Martinique, right? A place that people in that community at least seem to have no kind of real sense of, but there's a scalar politic at work there that allows us to imagine beyond the rubric of the nation state, beyond the rubric of the even of the kind of of the racial formation, a chlordacone kinship, right, or a chemical kinship is something I was talking about with folks at lunch today. A chemical kinship that offers us a different way of thinking, not just the coloniality. The colonial relationships that give rise to this kind of contamination, but also the kind of response people might be able to offer.
Oh, thank you. So I'm opening up the floor for questions. Yes?
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. This is mind-blowing. I love your work. I think it's fantastic. My question actually goes in the direction of the chemical kinship, and I wonder, and certainly with this image also of this molecule, to what extent maybe the digital space can help you in your research, not just as as an archive or a technical instrument, but maybe also as a pattern or a blueprint in this mapping of geopolitics. And while you were talking, I was thinking about Alondra Nelson's work on DNA, and the which is another mapping of, if you will, like rekinship, diaspora in Africa, which of course then opens up so many interesting questions about imagined communities, or just destroying the notion of the nation state through these digital spaces. So I wonder, if to what extent could we fit, or get your work. I don't want to take it away from the physical world, but also in a sense of this chemical kinship. Is there some kind of quote-unquote playground in the digital?
Thank you so much for that question, and I'm going to be calling upon you to brainstorm some more with me about this very issue. So I've just started a digital project called Visualizing Chemical Entanglement, and I'm working with these fantastically brilliant people who know how to use software like GIS mapping, ArcGIS. Are you all familiar with these things? I am not. But they are teaching me a lot about how we might use digital tools to bring together so-called big data, like contamination information, cancer registries, information. I'm working with a research assistant who's doing work on the factory in Brazil where this was being produced, and the kind of environmental disasters that have taken place on Pesticide Alley in Brazil around this place. So bring all this big data about the chemical into conversation with what I'm calling small data. Again, it's a scalar question. As someone who works via interview and via conversation and oral history, I'm going to these places and asking people to talk a little bit about their bodies, what they know of chemical contamination, and trying to use clips of those alongside the big data to try to kind of chart a digital landscape for this thing.
We need to talk.
Let's please talk.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
as you can hear, I'm still kind of trying to figure out what it looks like. I was in Hopewell in November to do my first round of interviews, and it was mind-blowing and interesting and exciting. And I'm excited to figure out how I can connect people there with people on the ground in Fort-de-France, thinking about the same issues across languages, across time zones, all those kinds of things.
There was another question, I think. Over there, okay.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, because it was really highly complex, and you managed still to make it, to put it together in a short presentation. So thank you so much for that. And I already knew about your work, but now you brought in so many new, interesting aspects, so it makes me want to read more of it. I was wondering if you bring up in your work, because you're talking about discontinuity, and it's absolutely brilliant how you're using this example. And if you encountered in the interviews in Martinique the continuity also of the colonial discourse on food and the framing of the French colonial discourse telling people not to eat local food. I'm talking about before the chlordecone, right? Saying that cassava and yam and all of these things, they will make you big, and they don't have vitamins, right? And when you're talking about this, I'm thinking, wow, how crazy, because now they can use arguments to tell people that they should not eat local food, although we know that there were survival elements that help so many people be strong enough to survive all of these oppressions. And the other aspect I want to ask you about is about the continuity of the Beke, right? Because now they don't own the plantations anymore, but I think they still have something like 70% of the agro-industrial complex. So could you give an input on that?
Sure. Thank you so much for the questions. I'll start with food. I'll start with food because I think it's in some ways the harder question. So part of my work has been with an organic, a collective of people who are doing organic farming on the island, which is kind of a misnomer because most of them do have chemical contamination in their soils, but they're trying to grow food as healthily as they possibly can, and to offer it up for sale at a market once a week. And one of the things that has been striking is what I will say is I had a conversation with Raphael Confiant, who is the person who breaks this story in 2007. He is, many of you will know his work as a literary critic, as a professor at the university in Martinique. But he said to me recently, I can't believe that a chemical killed a political idea. It's paraphrasing, right? So the idea of sovereignty is critically dependent upon an idea of food sovereignty or the possibility of food sovereignty. And he's a long-time independentist political activist on the island. And he said it's actually the chemical that has killed our political idea because we can't eat locally without contaminating ourselves further, right? And that was kind of it was one of those moments where my stomach kind of dropped out because he's quite insightful, and in a lot of ways, we have lots of different conversations about our gender politics being different in other ways. But I think that was a pretty powerful moment where we can think about how very difficult it is to imagine a kind of a politics like we might have had before around food as nourishment, as what kind of keeps us strong as a people living in a place. That wasn't very deep, but yes, food. Then the continuity of the Beke. Yes, these families, this small kind of minority of people on the island, still control the grand majority of enterprises that matter economically. And so agribusiness to supermarkets to the shipping containers at the ports, they run things, even though on the face of the politics on the island, we have kind of popular representation. And so I think the question of continuity is really a question about neocolonialism, is a question about the ways that things really do not change, even when we have a kind of shift in political status. That I think is what's always been so interesting about the choices Martinicans have made to stay a part of France. They've always been articulated as a desire to keep the Beke from running things on the island, right? So people look to Paris and say, at least we will have protection from Parisian sources of power, because if we were to be independent, the Beke would run things on this island, right? So there's a kind of triangulation between these two kinds of colonial power. It's a rock and a hard place at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vanessa. Oh, there's another. Okay, one last question before we move on.
Yeah. Vanessa, thank you so much. The juices in my brain are starting to flow again. Feel really inspired. It's beautiful work. And I was wondering, you were talking about the chemical kinship, and you already kind of answered the question with your answer to Leila's question and to Peggy's question. But I still wondered if there's a possibility in the African diaspora for us to use the same chemical kinship in the decontamination phase. So can we decolonize ourselves, our minds, spiritually, politically, and our bodies, physically, chemically, in the same way that we've been contaminated, kind of along those same axes? Can we use those paths amongst ourselves to decontaminate ourselves?
That's a beautiful question and an important one. I think, and I'll be brief because I know we need to, I think the question now, if we are trying to imagine reparation or justice or freedom or liberation or any of those things, is how to imagine those things with the toxicities that we already have on board, right? The toxicities in our bodies, in the bodies of land that we are walking on, are not going anywhere. So how do we imagine freedom without having to kind of return to a space of pure, normal, healthy, heteronormative, often bodies, right? The return is no longer possible in the same way that, a lot of the discourse on the Middle Passage says, that there is no return, right? There's no return from this particular kind of material engagement and entanglement. So I think part of the task is to imagine, what does freedom look like for us now if the return is not possible? So thank you.
So I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I had to think of a certain moment in my research a few years ago, because you were talking about these cancers and stuff like that. And when I was doing my doctorate, I stumbled on a cell line, which was called the first immortal cell line of all times, Henrike. Yeah. I don't know if it plays any role in your work, and I had to think of it because this lady, 1951, an Afro-American lady, the cells were taken without any permission and cultivated, and me in 2000 and something doing my PhD on her cells, And later on in 2013, the whole genome was, again in Germany, was decoded and commercialized, again without any permission from the lady's family. So I don't know if it plays any role in your work, but when I stumbled on it, I found it very interesting, and it made me think of it now in your lecture.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I don't know if this is on. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I'll just say, if you haven't checked out this story, the story of Henrietta Lacks, she is an African-American woman who had a very rare and very virulent form of cancer, which made her cells replicate very, very quickly, and after her death, she was essentially farmed for her cells, and her cells have been the basis for quite a lot of biological research, genome research, without her family's permission, clearly without her own permission after her death. And so there's a beautiful book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and there was a recent article, I do believe her family has received some sort of compensation.
They just settled, because it's not just that they harvest the cells, there are two components for that. Basically, every single medical student on Earth worked on her cells.
Yeah.
And there are at least 10 new vaccines
Right.
to her life, which are developed on the basis of the cells, because her cells survive longer than other cells.
Right.
And they actually also took medical research on her children and descendants without their knowledge. It took in the 90s when they finally found out.
Right.
So now they settled last year.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, unnamed, so I hope it's
Yeah, I hope it's good too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa. Maybe we can come back to some of those issues. We probably will later in the discussion. For now, I would like to welcome our next speaker, Nhi. And I want to give him a proper introduction as well. He's a fellow of the Institute for Postcolonial and Transcultural Studies at the University of Bremen and an independent curator. He holds a PhD in cultural studies and a diploma in political sciences. Since June 2014, he has served as a co-speaker of the Federation for Intercultural Welfare, Empowerment and Diversity. At some point, you have to enlighten me about what intercultural welfare is. Previously, he has held research positions at the New York University, at the University of Heidelberg, and the University of Tübingen. His research interests focus on postcolonial criticism, racism, migration, and Asian diasporic studies. He has curated different projects at the Hauskulturen der Welt and at the Hebel am Ufer in Berlin. His book Unrein und vermischt, postkoloniale Grenzgänge durch die Kulturgeschichte der Hybridität und der kolonialen Rassenbastarde, from year 2010, was awarded with the Augsburger Science Prize for Intercultural Studies in 2011. He's also the author of some widely acknowledged books, including Ethnizität und Migration Reloaded and Hype Hybridität. He has also edited the books Asiatische Deutsche, Vietnamesische Diaspora and Beyond, Revision, postkoloniale Perspektiven von People of Color auf Rassismus, Kulturpolitik und Widerstand in Deutschland. So, sorry I cannot translate all those book titles. They're a bit difficult to translate, but thank you very much for being here, Nhi, and welcome.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this introduction, which was much more than proper. I really feel a little bit ashamed that I give so much information about myself. But to be honest, I'm very happy to be here. Vanessa just gave such a great presentation and learned so much from her perspective and also on research about environmental racism in Martinique. And my talk will not deal that much with contested geopolitics. Because I'm not an expert in foreign policy and I'm also not an expert in African history or in Asian studies, so you might wonder why I'm here. Because maybe, this is my guess, maybe I have some limited knowledge about Germany and about German culture and German identity. And I really appreciate very much what Alexandra and also Bejeng, they delivered also a great presentation and a brilliant discussion about the connection between colonial past and colonial presence. And in my input, I will relate to their discussion about the questions of silencing, denial, amnesia, and non-remembering. And I try to develop or to discuss how these things might be related to the questions of self-colonization of German society, of the dominant white self as part of this colonization process. And I also want to thank Saskia and the whole Savvy team very, very much that they have the energy and the courage to make all these things happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Speaker's corner to deliver my input. Yeah, so let's go. In my paper, I will discuss colonial traditions in Germany's political culture, which is nonetheless connected with the post-colonial, historical rather than theoretical decentering of Africa beyond the colonial mantra. The one-dimensional reduction of Africa to the colonial experience may appear, particularly from an African perspective, to be a form of continued historical and intellectual impoverishment and cultural recolonization. Yet, on the other hand, we are often confronted by a dominant perspective in which European modernity appears to be only loosely and randomly connected with the century-old history of colonial conquest, which has lasting effects to the present day. The externalization of the colonial dimension from social, cultural, and national identity, and corresponding its one-sided outsourcing from the collective canon of knowledge is significant for the power of the colonial present. In this input, I am concerned not only with reappraising the past, I also want to suggest that the diminishing of the colonial dimension from Western cultural and social history resides in a social myth that fosters an irrational treatment of racism and colonial practices aimed effectively at ideological suppression. The maxim that something does not exist, or at least is unacceptable in the context of the carefully maintained political culture of Western Enlightenment, with its implicit claim of superiority, is particularly widespread in Germany. It leads to a selective self-image based on historical suppression and a political disavowal of reality. As a result, it is impossible to initiate social changes and to seriously engage in a critical, self-reflective dialogue in a global context. In Germany, colonialism, as soon as it is used as a critical, analytical category and not as in the norm, as a form of ideological authority, is an unacceptable, truly uncanny term. Its unfathomable depth seems so illusory that this unspeakable word is carefully avoided and shunned. Like criticism of racism, it reminds us of colonial oppression by white Germans and elitists, the need for immediate distancing. Usually, such deviation tactics are reflected in the yearning to forget the past once and for all. The refusal of the dominating white German society to deal with and to address the colonial roots of its own cultural history and political identity has far-reaching consequences. It reflects a process in which neither the subjugation of the other nor the colonial construction of the German nation are discussed. What's more, the continued power effects of this suppression on the current state of the German society is also not discussed. This issue becomes all the more dangerous and intolerable as we look at the troubling and ambiguous relationship between the past and the present, at the connection of outer and inner coercions. In short, at the unresolved actuality of German colonial culture. Up to now, the political silence, the concealment, the hushing up has to a large extent suppressed what needs to be said. Silence and silencing are deliberate forms of amnesia, and amnesia is a political expression of the collective memory. That is why consensual silence is a dominant articulation of power, which actively resists the reappraisal and visualization of imperial practices and images through deliberate acts of non-remembering, and which can only be pried open with counter-narratives. In its totalizing dimension, the power of collective forgetting can consolidate into a secondary colonization. Secondary colonization is not a blank space, but a social dynamic, which is established again and again through a set of construction and practices of power. As a result of secondary colonization, it is not only the continuities, transition, and gaps of colonial ways of thought, but also the actual history of the colonization of the German society itself that is continually smoothed by a wide veil of silence. On the other hand, black subjects who often resisted while being made victims are once again victimized as a result of the perpetrator's worship in the hegemonic discourses. Because the discursive means for describing realities colored by colorism are taboo or undeveloped, through this historical political whitewashing, a comfortable, illusory world was established and stabilized for white people. Also, the imprint of colonialism not only affects the reality of the European modernity, but it has also been fundamental for the formation of German culture and identity right up to the present. It is rarely discussed. In former West Germany, the reappraisal of the country's colonial history was badly neglected over a long period of time. Strangely enough, West German historians only began to deal with this epoch at the end of the 1960s. Equally significant is that despite the political responsibility resulting from the colonial past, interest in this area of research considerably declined already in the mid-70s. The more present impulses for an academic review of German imperialism, therefore, came initially not from German academia, but from black German scholars like Maya Yim, like Katharina Oguntunye, like the Adefra Women's Collective, like people also like Peggy Peache and Fatima El Tayyib. And these impulses came also from black scholars and activists from the field of transatlantic black diaspora studies, Anglo-American German studies, and transnational post-colonial criticism. The number of academic and popular works about this subject has noticeably increased in recent years in Germany. However, the growing discursive interest is a result of a catching up movement in a country where critical accounts of German colonialism were socially undesirable and marginalized in academia over a long period of time. Owing to this constellation, a considerable need to make up for this deficit has emerged in academia, politics, and society, and has resulted in an enormous backlog in basic research. Two further constraints have also been exposed as structure forming and trend setting. Within this historiographic production of knowledge, the bulk of colonial history research deals with the colonization of areas outside of Europe, whereby the reciprocal and dialectic process of outer colonization of the other and inner colonization of the white self is segregated, and the production of boundaryless spaces in the process of colonization is given scant attention. It is true that there's an increasing number of publications which besides the colonies, also explore the effects of imperialism, of the imperialist expansion in Germany itself during the WIR era. But these approaches remain limited to historical research and interpretation of the period from 1884 up to 1918, and in a few cases up to 1945. Studies that analyze the continuity and transformation of colonial ways of thinking, images, and structures right up to the present day in Germany are still fairly rare and are usually found within the field of culture studies or media studies, but less likely in political science and sociology. As long as the interaction of merging temporal and social settlements is not thematized and academic reviews remains purely historical, the impact of colonization on the racist condition of the German society today cannot be analyzed or understood. Without understanding history as an open and dynamic field, it is impossible to raise the question of colonial presences. Up to now, even in critically intended German research about racism, the colonial roots and elements of racist forms of dominance and violence are not taken fully into consideration or incorporated into the analysis. To overlook the historic materiality and entanglement of colonial racist power and exploitation practices will result in the rejection of opportunities for a deeper understanding of today's conflict situations. In fact, it is precisely the interconnection of different temporalities and the overlapping of spatial interaction processes that lead to new insights and political starting points for intervention. In contrast to the usual historiography or other social and cultural historical approaches, colonial history is here seen as a starting point for more far-reaching development that is not temporarily self-contained and that does not view colonialism as a one-way street from the perspective of the European motherland. I would now like to turn my attention to the contradictory interaction of Raum, Traum, and Trauma, or space, dream, and trauma, as starting conditions for colonial policy, and thereby to outline, above all, how the colonization process affected the colonial culture of Germany. I suggest to highlight that colonialism created numerous cultural artifacts and practices whose meanings have been incorporated into the imaginative expanses of Germany's cultural, memorial, academic landscape. For example, traces of colonialism are still to be found in the urban environment of Berlin and in the political topography of Germany. The long shadow of internal colonization is by no means only kept alive in the colonial view of black people or time-worn African cliches. We are still confronted by a historic situation that is characterized by practices of discrimination and a lack of experience of internal decolonization. We also need to recognize that the scale and specific orientation of today's racist power relationship cannot be separated from the colonial experience. There is little doubt that the enthusiastically received colonial policy contributed to a structural, cultural, and not least administrative anchoring of the potential for aggression against and devaluation of people of color. The everyday occurrence of racist relationships is apparent not only in scandalous experiences of violence and discrimination, for example in dealing with German authorities and laws, but also in representative and epistemological forms. For this and other reasons, we need to deal with the continued effects of colonial racism and the normalizing practice of racialization, which constructed racial identity as inherent in human nature and thereby uncircumventable. The idea that people have an indisputable innate racial identity and affiliation is of course a colonial invention, which however is not recognized as such. Its unbroken power in terms to categorize human individuals make this construction one of the most fundamental and far-reaching legacies of the colonial era that can be experienced on a daily basis. A long series of German philosophers and academics such as Immanuel Kant and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, to name just the most famous masterminds, made significant contribution in the name of European enlightenment and rationality to the formation and promotion of racial theories in Western general knowledge. One thread of this pseudo-academic development resided in the German theory of racial hygiene, a theory which was already being formed at universities during the colonial German Empire and which found its most loyal supporters among the educated middle classes and the social elite. During the Nazi era, racial hygiene played a significant role in the industrialized policy of externalization, since it involved the development of biopolitical techniques for the identification, selection, and concentration of the population groups to be exterminated, and proved to be an ideologically reliable instrument for the German Nazis. The German contribution to global colonization takes place in the context of a worldwide political destruction and transformation process, which has lasted over several centuries. I'm interested in how, through the colonization of the Western metropolis themselves, colonial spaces and practices came into existence, and which in the context of colonialism without colonies have been passed down to the present day. Colonization not only had a devastating effect on people and societies in the newly created colonies, it also created a lasting change in German society, in which everyday life and institution became extensively aligned with the modern requirements of a colonizing state. The colonies were used not only as raw material suppliers, settlement areas, and as business and capital markets, but also as laboratories of modernity and schools of the nation. Accordingly, the effects of self-colonization on the military, political, cultural, ideological, economic, academic, technological, and urban spheres of the Vietnamese society were highly visible and dramatic. Here's a good point to consider the epic significance of the Berlin Africa Conference in 1884 and 85, during which, at the invitation of the Reichskanzler Bismarck, 40 main European colonial powers divided up an entire continent amongst themselves with complete disregard of the interests of the people who lived there. During this negotiation marathon, nothing less was established than the future formation and the rules of the European occupation of Africa. The contractually agreed geopolitical new formation of the continent enabled a systematically applied colonial project on a massive scale, which, based on the borders drawn up at the conference, gave birth to a new era and completely artificial societies. The global political significance of this event is hard to overestimate, since the scramble for Africa, which was already underway, was now multilaterally organized and developed in the direction of a temporary and fragile balance of power among the interested European empires, which lasted until the First World War. It can be asserted without exaggeration that the geopolitical origin of today's Africa, as well as the basic structures of its current cartography, are founded in the German capital. As a result of its dominion over the so-called protectorates, German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, German Cameroon, and Togoland, Germany became a major colonial power with schizophrenic claims to global leadership, manifested in the expansive and multiple division of Germany into cultural and political doppelgangers. In terms of its political and cultural origins, however, the colonial design project Africa is a product intellectually made in Germany. Right from the beginning, seen in this light, colonial and post-colonial Africa was never a distant, unknown, dark continent at the origin of time, but the result of European projections, wishful thinking, and compromises of power, which resulted in part from the diplomacy of the German host at the conference, Berlin, in particular, had no interest in the fact that some of the major Western powers competing with Germany, such as France and England, were exploiting the huge area of the Congo basin with its manifold resources and economic opportunities, and impeding Germany's rise to world power. The fact that as a compromise solution, the Congo was handed over to the private ownership of the Belgian King Leopold II, who established a particularly brutal regime of exploitation and terror in which half of the population, up to 10 million Africans, was killed within over 20 years. And a large number of forced laborers, including children, were mutilated as a form of punishment and deterrence. It's also a result of the German negotiation strategy. Despite these and other atrocities, which also includes the usual degradation and heteronomy of colonization, Africa was, in the colonial imagination, the stepchild of European parents who were separated and, as in a marital battle, sometimes argued with each other about parents' rights, vanities, and access. Although the African Conference in Berlin represented a prominent milestone on the road to the imperialist era, symbolically as well as pragmatically, in Germany, a fiction was established that denied the country's significant involvement. This fiction was also represented for a long time, both linguistically and in terms of cultural memory. This event, which today could be described as a political mega event, was treated as if it had never taken place in Berlin. In Germany, the term Congo Conference was preferred to the internationally prevalent term Berlin Conference 1884. Similarly, the resulting multilateral act that resulted from the conference, which is internationally referred to as General Act of the Berlin Conference, is conveniently abridged to the Congo Act in Germany. It is only in recent years, in the course of new accounts of German colonial history, that the term Berliner Afrika-Konferenz, Berlin Africa Conference, has been used more frequently. This special linguistic development is an interesting example of how colonial practices have been separated from Germany's history and German culture. In this way, not only an important place of origin and starting point of German and European colonialism is obliterated, but ways of remembering are denied. This example illustrates how colonial structures, dimension, and traditions are expressed not only in the explicit defense of racist values and colonial images, but equally in non-recognition and processes of covering up and externalization. Therefore, it is fundamental to ask what role the imprints of colonialism play in German culture and national identity. Within this short input, I only have the opportunity to briefly outline the anatomy of German colonial society. Due to the division of labor in society as a whole, many sectors of society in Germany became part of a colonial infrastructure through the colonization of non-European countries. Consequently, the colonial movement came into being as a socially organizing power. A chain of colonial location and production facilities in Germany came into being, which was organized and aligned according to imperial interests. Germany's rise to a globally active imperial power necessarily went hand in hand with the creation of a colonial administrative apparatus. Particularly in Berlin, the capital of Imperial Germany, a new center of power came into being. Berlin became the starting point of a colonial world empire, which tried to rule over its non-European territories and their inhabitants through a variety of government bodies, such as the Reichstag, the Reichskolonialamt, Imperial Colonial Office, and the Supreme Command of the colonial troops. There was little opposition to colonial policy in German society and in the Reichstag. Not even the social democratic faction was united in its repudiation. A significant number of social democrats regarded the creation of colonies as a necessarily civilizing cultural deed and demanded a better form of colonialism. Among the middle classes and the elite, enthusiasm for colonialism was almost unanimous. They were intoxicated by the idea of a German world power and relish their role as imperial masters. The colonial movement gathered in mass organizations such as the influential Deutsche Kolonialgesellschaft, German Colonial Society, and the Alldeutscher Verband, or German Association. Besides lobby work and propaganda, these organizations tried to advance the Germanization of occupied overseas territories through settlement, immigration. On the other hand, the forced association brought about by colonialism led to a stronger presence of black people in German cities. Over time, the presence of black people increasingly stirred up immigration and biopolitical debates about the possibility or impossibility of acculturation and settlement. Particularly when it came to questions of interracial sexuality and marriages, these debates took on an unforgiving tone. Besides colonial immigration, diverse material, culture, and consumer products made their way to Germany via transcontinental trade routes and in the import and export business. The economic webs between the periphery and the center resulted in an extensive economic network and infrastructure for colonial goods of every kind. The showplaces of this colonial economy, its factories, trading houses and showrooms became part of the urban environment and the everyday world of the Germans. Economic interest also facilitated the development of a German colonial culture and culture industry that served the consumer demand for exotism and racial stereotyping. Travel novels, exhibition of racialized native newspaper reports, photographs, later also films, advertising, posters, and other media of popular cultures made colonial fantasies accessible to the masses. In these practices of representing the other, colonialism was turned into an everyday consumer good and at the same time emphasized hierarchical structures. These representation spaces connected the symbolic and the real world into imaginary projections that were defined by the gates of the white subject and which were loaded with colonial pedagogy. The colonial experience with its images that are still circulating in Germany to this day strongly affected the construction of whiteness and otherness. The possibility of open-minded encounters was negated by colonial attributions and racist processes of power inequality. Under these circumstances, images of the self and other were racially defined and forced into a rigid relationship of belonging and foreignness, of domination and subordination. Now I'm coming to the end of my input. During the colonial era, a monument to German imperialism was created in the form of an urban landscape with colonial street names, thus imprinting Germany's global influence on the collective memory. The center of the symbolic geopolitical appropriation in the Berlin district of Wedding is the African Quarter, which is complemented by the names of German occupation in the Pacific and China. An important impulse for this colonial quarter, which was created between 1899 and 1958, was provided by the notorious Hamburg entrepreneur Karl Hagenbeck, who ran a thriving business in animal trading and human zoos. As the colonial exhibition in 1896 proved, so-called anthropological exhibition could attract huge audiences, and Hagenbeck planned to establish a permanent exhibition with wild animals and exoticized people in the nearby Rehberge Park. The historic background of the street topography demonstrates how the Sinti Quarter was also intended as a consumable colonial urban landscape. In the end, the dream of an amusement park and zoo with colonial attractions stayed virtual. In the end, nevertheless, this story has not only left behind its historical traces, but also a real and visible district of colonial artifacts. To me, this interrelation of different levels of reality and time is significant for the colonial and post-colonial constellation in Germany and especially also in Berlin. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that we can have a discussion, and also, I'm very excited to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nhi, for bringing up a range of very important questions, also making some very important connections that we've been trying to make in the course of this conference many times. So thank you very much. I would like to open up the floor for questions. Is there any? If not, I'll use the opportunity to ask my question. You said somewhere in the beginning of your talk, you were talking about the difference between East Germany and West Germany in terms of dealing with German colonial history, which I think brings in an interesting, shift to the question of borders and nations in this realm. So how these two different states actually, the existence of these two different states influence, the politics of memory around colonialism, which I think is a topic that we have to still talk about much more. So I was wondering if you can say one or two words about that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I want also to apologize that my input was much longer than I intended. So maybe, I give you too much input. I think this is a very interesting question because East and West Germany, were different on different levels, but also there's something that similar and common. I'm not a historian, but I read and I know that the historical discourses in East and West Germany were quite different in regard of how to deal with German history. As I said in my input, Germany's historical past wasn't a subject of research or political discussion in West Germany until a very brief wave of interest in the of the '68 generation, who were politically interested in anti-imperialism. The Vietnam War was a huge topic of political mobilization and also of a way to criticize Western policy in this case in Southeast Asia, and therefore some of the '68 generation developed a sense and tried to work and make research on Germany's colonial past. But of course, this basic research was very limited, and also it ended quite abruptly in the middle of the '70s. In East Germany, we have a different political context. East Germany regarded itself as a communist state and as an anti-capitalistic state, and according to Lenin's famous thesis that imperialism is the latest stage of capitalism, East German ideology, was quite interested in the political and ideological opportunities to criticize West Germany in terms of system competition between a capitalist and a communist states, and therefore they tried to bring up, and therefore they tried to make some research in German. In German colonialism, but of course there was this political interest and also this political instrumentalization of German history, and of course this research didn't take questions into consideration like the linkage between racism and colonization. The questions of whiteness wasn't a topic at all because East German officials and also East German historians took the idea of Völkerverständigung, Völkerverbundenheit, of the friendship of the people of the world took that for granted because of this ideological framework of communist friendship.
Okay, thank you. Yes, let's start over there.
Thank you very much. I have only a remark, it's not a question, because I have the feeling there's a lot of people here who might not be from Berlin. And regarding the African streets, it's quite funny that actually quite a lot of African people moved to these African streets. So now today you can find in Kamerunerstraße, for example, a quite nice Cameroonian restaurant. And I was never quite sure why. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe they feel like that's our street. I'm not sure. Someone could make a research about this, and I would be very interested to find out. And I wanted to mention that if you go a little bit further into the back of Berlin, behind the African Quarter, you find allotment gardens, and they are actually still called Kolonie, because the word colony was also used for allotment gardens. So a bit behind the Kamerunerstraße, you actually find the Kolonie Togo. It's just a remark for maybe someone who wants to do some research, I don't know.
I also want to comment on your comment, if you'll allow me to do that. I think that black people are living everywhere in Berlin, and not only in Wedding, but and if they are living, especially in Wedding, then the question is why. I mean, Wedding has the image, and also the social infrastructure of Wedding is that the apartment, that the people have to pay for, might be still affordable for black people who are also marginalized in terms of income, in terms of social status in German society, and therefore so maybe they are attracted by Wedding because it's an affordable area for black people, and so the question of urban concentration, of urban gathering, is also connected to the question of social status, of access to labor markets, and also, of course, of access to the education system. And I think this is very significant, and also on a symbolic level, that the colony Togo is part of this African Quarter here in Wedding, which is just a short walk from the conference where we are right now. And I think this is a kind of the tricky and ambiguous relationship that the past and the present is related to each other. That you cannot understand the present without acknowledging and knowing the past, and of course, the African Quarter is now a part of Berlin's urban landscape, is part of Berlin's urban history as a colony Togo, and I think both terms and also both places say something about the colonial relationship between Berlin and these African and colonial destinations.
I just, before we get to your question, I just wanted to comment on that comment too, which I find that's true, and your response to it is also quite true. But I wanted to shift a bit from why they go there, the intentions, be it intentional or not intentional, and I wanted to bring up the concept, the tendency of appropriation. They are there. They make use of the space. They make whatever they want to do with it, and they own the space. They appropriate it, and they use it for better or for worse. That is it. So that's how I see it. It is something that always comes up, but I see it as a very, in urban theory, as a very interesting example of appropriation of space. That's what I just wanted to say about it.
And it's maybe also important to add that there's been a lot of initiatives in Berlin since many years already to rename those kind of street names, sometimes successfully, as for example in the case of Meyer-Jim-Ufer. And there have been activists that have been working on this, some of whom are in the room today for many years. So it's also important to acknowledge their work. But it's still very difficult to rename those streets, It was very easy to rename all the communist street names in East Berlin, very, very quickly after the fall of the wall. But we're still fighting to rename, streets that are called after people who've committed genocides. Yeah.
I'm sorry, because I already have 2 microphones, so maybe this gives me a privilege.
That gives you the power to continue.
Ask my question if I can, okay? Because I was like raising my hand just in the same time. So I have this question which is extremely difficult to ask actually, and I wonder how do I pose it, and maybe also if we don't want to answer it immediately, then we can keep it for later or something. But since your presentation was quite largely on a meta-theoretical it was more of a meta level than going exactly in the factographies and geographies of the colonial. I somehow it's a methodological question, and because somehow on one hand I think that we should contribute all this conference to the issues of the colonization and particularly the colonization of Africa. So we should stay local with African context and repercussions of it. On the other hand, I can't stop thinking of the Second World War as a colonial project, specifically the German invading half of Europe and then a lot of territories during the Second World War. So my question is, how are we so selective in not even mentioning the Second World's rhetoric, the fascist narrative and all that as a colonial entity, and why doesn't it, I mean, somehow I was also thinking of that during the previous presentation where we went to Caribbeans, and I was like, okay, if Caribbeans can be there, so maybe let's also look at the fascist project as a repercussion of colonial imaginary and as an element of it. So I'm not sure how to deal with that, because on one hand I would be super curious to hear basically everybody's opinion on that, because I think it's an important question somehow. On the other hand, I know the topic of the conference and the necessity of not taking too much time off. So maybe the moderators, or maybe we can collectively decide what we do with this issue, but I wouldn't also like to silence it completely, so yeah.
Okay, no, thank you for the question. Let me just say a quick comment that, of course, we take, the Berlin Conference and the particular, colonial entanglement between Germany and Africa as a starting point, but we really take it as a starting point to think about all colonial histories. So that's why it was important for us also to bring, both in the exhibition, I don't know if you had a chance to see the exhibition, and in the conference, to bring, all geographies, histories, times into play. And then, do you want to say something to
yeah, I
the
think this is very important question about why the research on also in the political discourse about Nazi Germany and the politics of expansion, of occupation and conquest, you know, of the Nazi Reich is full of colonial elements. The Nazis use a very racist policy and theory, which of course has a very, it clearly has a colonial legacy, and therefore I would also suggest that you cannot really discuss and understand the historical phenomena of Nazi Germany and Nazi politics without taking the colonial history of Germany into account. And but what I observe is that in the academic and also in the public discourse about the Nazi time, we don't talk about, you know, about the colonial aspects of the Nazi ideology, of Nazi politics, and I think this is part of this problem that we are talking the whole day about the problems of non-remembering, of amnesia, of denial of the colonial past and of in Germany, and therefore I think, yeah, it would be a challenge, and I think it would be, and I also think that it would be a productive challenge if we can combine these two discursive straight with each other, the straight about talking about Nazi Germany and the trade talking about racism and colonialism in Germany, and I would agree that we need to put these things together.
Okay, thank you. That's actually an important question, and it's been coming up this morning too, and I think will keep coming up, the connection between those two histories. Thank you very much, Ni. I would like to go on to our... Sorry. Could we keep it...
I have more a concern.
Okay, can we make it a short question?
I have also a concern.
Okay.
In 2012, I found in the streets of Friedrichshain a Grundschule, I don't know how you translate this in English, is elementary school, history book, which is it was quite impressive, the volume of the book for the grade, and it goes through German history in chapters, and I was surprised to find there a chapter dedicated to the colonial times of Germany in Africa, but in a very strange position, which was first the Third Reich, the Nazi times, then the colonial times. I thought it is cited in different times, one previous to the other. And then I go to all these facts about racism, colonial past that are very much out there. Many people know about them, but where is this going, and how is this not reaching outside? How is not this going out there? And it makes me remind the first panel about the amnesia versus the erasure, or the denial versus the suppression. And my concern is, how can these kind of panels, this kind of intervention, these researchers that you have, the human source, the Nazi developing from the colonial experimentation in Africa, all this connection, all this network past, all these guys, how is this still some sort of taboo even, or is being maintaining a certain level that is not reaching a majority of the people? Or this is my concern. Why is this not really making an impact, and we just continue in a sort of a circle questioning why this happened?
Thank you, Ismail. Peggy, you want to add something before?
Yes, I want. Yeah, Ni, I find in your last response, I find you a little too actually too polite or too in a way of maybe even too positive. I want to caution us here a little bit and trying to connect actually your talk also back to Bilgem's in the morning, where I think that two of the interventions coming in here today to your talk shows us that we really need to investigate some fundamental notions and how they connect to each other. Bonaventure already said something about appropriations. So that goes in both ways, you know, to say, of course, I mean, this is our space as well, you know, what the heck. But also in the different way, and it seems to me that also what you just mentioned, you know, that colonialism or the collective experience of the other is only comprehensible once it is somehow intelligible to the own, something to a European piece or snipsel of experience. And that's why I'm actually very concerned about, you know, it's not a new thought, this whole thing of colonialism. If you ask, you know, historians in general, hegemonic research driven, we don't get a comprehensible definition. But once it gets to Volk ohne Raum, once it gets to the perspective of the East, we are suddenly talking about, or are happy to talk about, you know, the colonialism of Europe or the colonial enterprise of Poland, you know. There is tons of research on that, you know. And I don't dispute that, but I find it interesting in a mental stage how easy we get to that, you know, once we are on the turf, you know, on the map of whiteness. And then from there, it seems, you know, and we have to see what the consequences of that. The consequences are disastrous. They basically mean to empty out the original to begin with again, and to basically declare our collective experience as the copy, you know. That's the one which came behind, you know, which came after, in the sense of, you know, we approached colonialism in this very slow and almost not there, you pointed that out, you know, collective memory through World War II, through National Socialism, without connecting it really in where it came before that, you know. And so I really like us to keep that in mind and to think about what kind of dynamics here are in play, that we seem to only be able to comprehend something once we link it back to the map of whiteness. So we are still, you know, feeling some kind of awkward to talk about the colonial experience there and what is, you know, the frontier, etc. But yeah, well, wait a minute, you know, we had this German stormtroops, and why are we not doing that here, you know? And also with regards to Berlin and the African Quarter, yes, as you already mentioned, there is a lot of movements going on, a lot of there are activist groups working on that, but also not just to rename streets, but to, in this sense, to appropriate. You know, there is a so-called Lern- und Erinnerungsort, a space, you know, which is an imaginary space, which is a physical space, to claim and appropriate and not just to react. You know, that's something, you know, if you are interested, you can check that out. So I caution us, because that, I think it goes directly in what you were talking about, you know, space, dreams, and drama, you know, which sounds so much better in German, you know, Raum, Traum, Trauma, that the bottom of the essence of these notions seems to be so much linked, emotionally linked to whiteness, that we still can only talk about that in terms of colonialism, in terms of the other, once we have a piece of suffering coming back.
I think we have to keep it very short, because we're
try to keep my remarks very short.
Thank you.
Ismail, I can completely understand, you know, that you are shocked when you are going through German, you know, books for students, and there's some research going on. Of course, this research is still in the beginning, And for example, Bejeng will present her research results. And what I heard is that she is quite shocked, when she went through this, through the canon of school books that are used in the present day in German schools, and they are full of stereotypes. They are also very centric in the way that that other perspective of colonized people, for example, are really left out of the pages of German school books, and so there are many different problems connected with this area of education, and I'm quite pessimistic because what I learned is that we can try to change the media discourse, we can try to change the academic discourse, but we need really to do all these works before we can change the discourse as a school. So this is maybe one of the areas that that is quite traditional, and it's very likely that it will stay very white-centric in that sense. And the second comment is to Peggy. I thank you very much, for your comments. I really appreciate that. It's very important what you said, and also I completely agree what you said. And also, like I tried to mention it in my talk, the historical research, even the one which is intended to be critical, it's limited in its scope, it's limited in the perspective, and also the chance that we're here. It's really in German we would say, a lucky moment, in Glücksfall, because the spaces for critical discourses inside German academia and also outside of German academia is very limited, and therefore I really, it's precious, to have this conversation, to have this discussion today, and there's so much work to do, and we are still in the very much beginning of this process to deconstruct German identity and German culture.
Thank you very much. So I have the pleasure to introduce our last but not least speaker, Dirk Schmidt. We're very happy that he was able to join us today because he's actually been one of the, and still is one of the central figures who's brought this kind of discourse to the German cultural scene in a broader sense. So we're happy to have him here and talk to him. I'll give him a proper introduction too. He's a German artist. Dirk Schmidt is a German artist who lives and works in Berlin. From 1984 to 1986, he studied art history and philosophy at the University of Bonn. In 1987, Schmidt started studying art at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf and ended his studies as a Meisterschüler of Professor Hüppi in 1992. From 1996 to 1997, he studied at the Rijksakademie van Bildende Kunsten in Amsterdam. He works as an independent artist and writes for the art magazine Springerin. In his works, Schmidt critically engages with history, its depictions and perceptions. His most famous work, Die Teilung der Erde, which deals with colonial history and the Berlin Conference, has been shown at the Documenta in Kassel in 2007. And I would add, was one of the first major interventions in art scene dealing with this conference and this history. So thank you very much for joining us, Dirk.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Saskia. And linked maybe to my work, which I did, my paper is called The Division of the Earth, Abstraction from Rights. But I don't know, I will take off your term of appropriation. I want also to start with an example which I like very much, and that is from 2006 when the Namibian government was making a speech in the Rathaus, in Roten Rathaus. And he was speaking about the land reform, and he was speaking about the genocide the Germans did against the Herero, the San and the Nama between 1904 and 1908. And he was claiming the building as a building where the Berlin Conference was happening, which is of course not true, but it's interesting that he did it. And I think a lot of buildings in Berlin are already claimed as building where this conference was starting. So that is, for example, one example for this appropriation. The other one is the term genocide, because since 2004 there is this term genocide installed, and there is a kind of war about it, if this time has to be called as normal colonialism, or if it has to be called as a genocide. And at the end, I think since most academics are, since it's more or less clear that it is a genocide, I think also this link to between World War II or the Holocaust or the Shoah and colonial time is also quite, I think, in status quo in the academics. So Jürgen Zimmerer, for example, is one example because of that second genocide, which was in front of the first one, and also of the question if they are comparable or not. In 2006, there came one big article published in the FAZ, which was called Vollbrachte Hitler eine deutsche Tat, nee, eine koloniale Tat. Also the reverse of it. Also did Hitler done a colonial act? But back to my paper. The division of the earth goes back, or is the name of one of one newspaper for that conference, and of course it goes back on this map of the African continent of it projects on the conference. It projects on the continent division, which was finished in 1910. But if you open the first image, you can see that 130 years ago, yesterday, there was only one decision done, and that was the border, the fixation of the border of the Free State Congo. So that is the only border which was created on the conference. And of course, okay, I come later to that. Abstract from rights, the second title goes back on that, what became for me quite important, that I understood this Berlin conference as a conference which was suddenly taking up occupation on the level of international law, which of course was a colonial law because Europeans were speaking. I want to stay a little bit in that conference, and in a second step, I want to go to, in a way, I want to answer that map with one map I did, and which describe a kind of reclaiming of territory, which of course is not anymore a geopolitical territory because that is not anymore possible in that case for the Herero or Nama, because they are not anymore a nation state, or they are not a nation state. No, it's okay. I start with a quotation from the Nama chief Hendrik Witbooi. It is from 1892, and as I followed it, it is for me it's the first mentioning of the Congo Conference by an African or from the African continent. It's interesting on several levels, but I quote it. He's writing to John Cleverly from the British magistrate in Walfish Bay. Hendrik Witbooi was in German Southwest Africa. He was the chief of the Nama, and a few years later, he was in war against the German state. He was also victim of the genocide. Dear Sir, I have heard that the British and the German government had a large meeting to decide who should make protection treaties with the chiefs of which country in Africa, and that you, the British, let the German have this land. But you stipulated at the meeting that no sheaf shall be forced. Now he goes on about how the Germans were using their treaties. They did with the Nama or with himself. He, the German, rules autocratically, enforcing his government laws. Right and truth do not interest him. He does not consult the country's chiefs, for he himself makes the law for our country, following only his own judgment. And the laws are quite insupportable, incomprehensible, and unbearable, intolerant, pitiless, uncouth. And then he goes on. I beg you kindly to be so good and forward this letter to the Cape government so that British politicians may hear about this and hold another conference and deliberate about the Germans to recall them, if possible, from our country. For they do not abide by the agreement and conditions under which you allowed them to enter this country. And then he finished, a man can always change what he has made if it is not good in his eyes, and if it does not no good. In a way, this quotation guides immediately in the contradiction which were during the conference, because on one hand you had the treaties, you had this kind of occupation of appropriation from the coast, which was in a way on a one-to-one A level. Also a subject was speaking to a subject. It was war or it was treaties, but it was a kind of agreement or conflict. In a way, you can call it contact zone. And on the other hand, you had a special article from this Schlussakte, which is chapter 6, and which was called effective occupation. Effective occupation made occupation quite easy. It had two articles. The first article was called notification, and that was meaning that if someone was if a European participant of that conference was interested, he had to announce which area he wants to have, and he had to show the border. The second one, effective occupation, was that he had to demonstrate that he can control this area, that he is installing military, that he is installing court, because one of the main issues of the conference was installing a trade in Central Africa, in the so-called conventional Congo Basin. This article was quite discussed. On one hand, because it was only linked to the coast, if it should be generalized to the whole country, or at the end to the whole world. On the other hand, it was said, no, occupation is not working like that. Occupation is something which has to do with conflicts. It's working on a one-to-one level. There's one quotation I want to give from the protocols. It is by the US ambassador, John Casson, and that shows really that contradiction which was running there. He speaks about the freedom, about the possibility of rights of the Indian population, but on the other hand, he speaks also of this occupation. So I quote: modern international law unfailingly pursues a path that leads to the recognition of the rights of the native races to control themselves and the inherited legacy freely. In agreement with this principle, my government, means the USA, would be ready to agree to a further rule that would rest on the principle for foreseeing the voluntary agreement of natives with their land being taken possession of in all cases where it is not provoked as an act of aggression. I spoke to the historian from Munich, Jörg Fisch, and I liked very much how he tried to understand this contradiction which were running on that conference. And he describes as a kind of paradigm shift on the principle of ownerless. The contradiction was solved by the formulation res nullius in international law. International law only recognizes states as subjects. A realm that does not belong to a state or does not count as a state is thus ownerless in terms of international law. It was clearly a legal abstraction that was technically very useful, but did not coincide with practice. Large realms of Africa and the political organization or kingdoms that existed, they could be termed ownerless because they did not correspond to the European state, to the European notion of the state. So at the end, to make it very short, before ownerless or terra nullius was land where no population was visible. With the conference, ownerless or terra nullius became a land where no political community was visible, which was like the European state. And I don't know, you have to make it clear that is spoken on the level of international law, that is in one act, that it was decided that the former subject of the contact zone, of conflicts, of war, or of the treaties was changed to the object of that international law. It was done about that. The law was now done on the African populations. And this loss of rights was installed in law. It was installed in international law. This becoming an object. That means it is installed on the level of language, and it's also installed on the level, on a long-term level, in a way that is structural violence. Okay, these two ideas, in a way, of occupation, which were crashing at the conference, are visible on that map, which shows the results of that conference. So at the border, you have the occupation with treaties, but only at the border, but in the middle. And that is, you see, before you had a kind of horizontal movement in occupation. Suddenly, that movement is vertical. You see, top-down made a square which was done on the basin of the Congo. And that was called the Free State. At the end, the talk about occupation, the talk about trade was all the time exampled by the Free State, which was the 15th the 15th subject who signed the Schlussakte, the Akte General. What you also see is that this occupation, in a way, is fiction. This square looks quite empty because nobody, no European has visited it. And if you would go closer, then a lot of the names which were written there, they are only called Dörfer, villages. It's just placed there, but it has nothing to do with the reality. So it's a kind of fiction which was placed, but you can imagine that this map of 1910, everyone knows, was only drawing directly the line to that square. Okay, so far my small trip to the Congo conference. And now I want to go to my interest or my work. I was starting on that because I try to make images on this international law. I had the question if this abstraction is possible to get an image. And the second one was also a kind of following the reclaiming of that territory which was gone with the conference or within the next 15 years. But I was following the reclaiming of the appropriations which were done especially by the Herero and Nama. So I was several months also in Namibia, in special on the level of international law, as that law which was written there. And I want to go on just to link it to another element which is quite important also in the discussion of memory politics, to a quotation of Thomas Leslie O'Reilly from 1917. And he was the person who had to make a report on the German colonization, on the German way of colonization in German Southwest Africa after the genocide, because as a base to take away the Germans that conference, that colony. And so he was traveling around. He was meeting a lot of Herero and Nama, still partly living in some camps because they had lost the land, of course, as an effect of that genocide. And then he made a note on this report, on the first draft of the report, and the note was, the natives of Southwest Africa had been waged in the German balance and found to be wanting. The right of existence was apparently not justified. The right of existence, this is genocide. Also he speaks 1917 as, in a way, about that something was happening like a genocide. That was also the result of that blue book. And then he was going on. But what about the pledges given in the Berlin Congo and the Brussels conference? That I found very interesting also in the reception of the Congo conference, because it was also understood as a conference which should regulate colonialism in a better sense in the future. Thomas O'Reilly was believing in the conference and couldn't understand what was happening. This blue book is a special element because there are only 6 copies left in Germany and in Namibia. One got stolen now, so it's only 5 which are left. And that book is not public. Also, if you're interested, if you're academic and you're interested, you can have it, but it's not allowed to publish it. Because there's agreement between the British and the Germans to take it off from the public. For the Germans, it's just propaganda. For the Namibian side, it's oral history. It's written down oral history, and it's a witness of the genocide. I was once making a conference at the University of Lüneburg, and it was the same ambassador, Peter Katevivi Herero, and he was fighting for the blue book, and then at the same time had a lawyer there, and he was really claiming it, or formulating, describing it as propaganda, and you had a big fight about that. As again, a situation of appropriation, or a situation where, I don't know, territory, the Herero cannot get any more on the status of a subject of law, of a kind of state, but that is the level on that they try to claim something back. For example, to get the blue book accepted as a document of witness. And maybe now we can go to the next photo. So it was a Herero who tried to use that international law with which they lost the rights in a way in 1884 without knowing about it, but they used it because they tried to make a claim in front of an US court, which is quite complicated because you can only call international law if you're a nation state, but of course the nation state is Namibia, and the Herero and the Nama as a kind of political community, as a state, are gone with colonialism. But there was a trick, and they tried to do it. And what I tried to do with my, I don't know, in the end, there were about 14 paintings. I tried to make a kind of reoccupation or reclaiming of territory on the level of a map. Or in that case, because you have the footsteps, maybe you can go on one image. The next one. It goes back on the so-called Utrupa. And the Utrupa was a kind of special commando during the war. But after the war, when also with the indigenous rules from the German meeting in a group was forbidden, they started to meet again to march, but to march with the empty hand. So it was an act of resistance. And it's quite funny because it's a mix between, it's quite affirmative, or Truppe to the German and to military. They were quite well military, the Heere anyway, maybe better than the Germans. But on the other end, it's also a dance. It's very satirical at the same time. So you have a commis, and he's like the imagination of the Germans shouting to the other people of the Utrupa. So that was for me the code I tried to use for the painting. This reclaiming with an Utrupa, with a symbolic kind of powerless, but also with your own body, as with your footsteps in the sand here. Maybe now we can go back. So you have the Utrupa from the left going to the space of the court, and this space makes in a way visible, but I think not in the digital projection because you cannot read the text, I think. But anyway, it made visible, at the end, in my impression, I was following the whole situation since 2004. It was the discussion on this international level of the lawyers, and because suddenly a lot of people from Africa and also from the USA were participating, which were creating a kind of pressure. I think it was a quite high pressure, and I think the step to court was in 2001. Anyway, I lost my line. Anyway, it created a big possibility to make this history of the genocide visible. Maybe much more than a lot of NGOs in Berlin and also in Namibia were doing. It had a quite high power because it was a language the German government had to follow in a way. And you can, I don't know if you follow the footsteps, and you can see the German side, the German state. Here, this is the German state, and they said now we have immunity, but the German companies, so the Deutsche Bank, the Wörmann line, and the Terex, which was a company for Cooper, they had to accept that there was a court running against them. And the German lawyer of course, they said, okay, we go back to the Convention of the Genocide, which is from 1948, but the Namibian side said, or it was especially a friend of me, a lawyer, and I made this painting with him together. Now we go back to the Haga Convention, because also the Haga Convention from 1899 has a kind of matrix for the genocide. So, yeah, so at the end, it made history quite visible, and it was also followed by an apology by the German Minister for Economic Cooperation Development, Bidjocka in 2004, and she went to Okakarara, which is Namibia, and she apologized for a genocide, but of course for a genocide, or she apologized for a crime which could be termed as a genocide, but it was not existing in 1904, and she was apologizing for God, but not in front of law, and she was apologizing for the act of one person, but not for the German military. But anyway, she stated this term genocide, and for example, since then, the Goethe Institute has the possibility to use the term genocide, but not before 2006 when she did it. So that is another example of this, of this appropriation or this conflict, claiming back, parts of the city, also part of the memory, or also claiming special terms. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dirk, for this very important intervention. And I would like to have more time actually to talk about, endeavors of remapping and, the kind of work that you're doing. Unfortunately, we cannot escape neither space nor time. In these days, we have the lecture at 6 p.m. the keynote lecture. So I propose that we have one question. And oh wow! Okay, someone was very fast.
Thank you. Thank you, Dirk, for your presentation. I really love what you're doing. I was very struck by your elaborations on the Blue Book. I'm just curious whether there's a copy here in Berlin at the National Library, or yeah?
Yeah, it is. But of course, there was once this exhibition in Germany divided. Anyway, it was an exhibition in the Deutsche Historische Museum, and this Blue Book was asked to be part of it, but it was under a glass case, and it was closed, that nobody can read it. And another example, the Namibian side, they made a print, so that's why it became so public in Namibia, and also so important. A lot of people were reading it, but the person who did it, he became trouble with his job at the university, and at the end he had to leave. So it's still a lot of struggle around this book.
Apology, which is about the apology. I mean, I'm sorry, I know we don't have time, but I have to say this because this is, of course, also a contested issue. She asked for forgiveness, right? Is that an apology? She referred to Völkermord, not to genocide, in her speech, in that very speech. And actually, it happened a couple of months later after, she was there in August, and I don't know if you were earlier there in the first session when I read out the resolution of the German Parliament. So we see that actually this entire 100-year commemorative moment, we cannot take out the Witzerek visit from the other context, that first there is a resolution in the parliament which actually defines it is not a genocide, and then this resolution is given to her, and it was actually drafted. If you look at the parliamentary debate, they speak about this visit of Witzerek that is going to happen, and in the end, when she does it, she asks for forgiveness in front of God. And what this means, it's the quest for reconciliation without a recognition. So I'm sure maybe we share this critique, but because you had to end it fast, but I just wanted to really highlight or emphasize or ask the question, what is an apology without recognition?
No, I think this apology was quite interesting, but it's quite ambivalent. And I spoke to her several years later, and she still says it was an apology on the level of the government. But the government now wouldn't say that.
Anyway, they refuted it. They said it is not an official one later on. Fischer said this is an individual apology.
Yeah, and she says it is an apologize from the government. She said it, otherwise I should lose my job. Anyway, what she did was placing the term genocide, and genocide and Völkermord is the same, of course.
No, it's, we can. No, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, this is Fischer refuted that, and you know, this image. I mean, I understand. You know, this is often referred to as this important turning point. But let's just take another image, right? Of, for instance, Willy Brandt kneeling in front of the Warsaw Ghetto in this affective moment that he did not. Apparently, he did not conceptualize, or he didn't plan to do the kneeling in front of the Warsaw Ghetto. So for her also, you know, I mean, I'm sure it would be interesting to have her and debate this here maybe, but you know, an apology in the literature and is an apology that is being has to be uttered by the chancellor or the president. I mean, this is how it is, you know, in Australia or in other places. This is the formal way. So she cannot apologize for the government. She doesn't have the function.
The government is not the state. Also, and deep apology is from the parliament or from the Bundespräsident. But of course, and government can make an apology, but it's only for the government, also for something like 50% of the parliament, and it's not deep, and it can be changed also.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to cut this discussion short. We have the lecture of Mantia Diawara, the keynote lecture at 6 p.m.